What's up, everybody? It's official. We have a tenant who left because of the pandemic. And now we're gonna go look at the house. And yeah, I'm wearing a Luigi shirt, and that's just what we're gonna have to deal with. I rented this SoCal 4-bedroom, 2-bath house to an amazing tenant back in January, just before the pandemic. Well, this tenant was self-employed, and today, he's gone. In this video, I'm going to cover 3 things while explaining what happened with the old tenant and the house. By the way, this is also good for both landlords and tenants, because if you're a tenant, well, you might want to try to make one of these options work for you. We're going to cover 1, how to deal with tenants not paying rent, how to rent during a pandemic, and number 3, how to deal with non-responsive tenants. Number 1, how to deal with tenants not paying rent. This is the hard thing, and that's what we had to deal with on this house. You have 3 options when a tenant isn't paying rent. Number 1, the best choice. This is sparkling water, okay? See, look, 0 calories. Number 1, the best choice. Find support for the tenants. Make sure the tenant has all possible housing assistance. And here's what happened with this house. So here's basically the gist of what ended up happening. The tenant was self-employed. The pandemic hit, and around April, the tenant said, hey, starting May 1st, I can't make my payments anymore. I barely got my money together for April 1st, and I can't make payments anymore as of May 1st. The tenant at the time had no idea that the $600 per week boost would apply to self-employed individuals. So we worked with the tenant to get him on unemployment in California, and he got it to take advantage of the retroactive boost. And he got retroactive pay, he got the $600 per week. Well, guess what happened, over the last couple months? There was so much uncertainty for his business and the possible continuation or not continuation of the boost that he decided, I can't live in California anymore, I'm moving. So he broke his lease and is now moving to Idaho. So obviously in this case, we worked with the tenant on getting them on the $600 boost that they weren't aware of in April. But keep this in mind, localities throughout the country are offering a lot of rental assistance programs. For example, Los Angeles has one, and many different other counties have these sort of rental assistance groups that are willing to help tenants get through this pandemic. So I personally suggest, as a landlord or as a tenant, familiarizing yourself with all of these options. It doesn't only have to be the government that supports us, and honestly, I think we've all found that the government sucks at being there right when we need them. The best case scenario is that, of course, both landlord and tenant walk away from the situation all caught up on payments. And so that brings up option number 2. Because there aren't always going to be local housing assistance programs, and there's not always going to be a boost. So you might be in a situation where the next best option is negotiating with a tenant or a landlord. So whether you're a landlord or tenant, this is a really good one to pay attention to. What I usually recommend is trying to see if there is an amount that both landlord and tenant are willing to pay. So for example, I wrote down some numbers here. Keep this in mind as well. If you're a great tenant, your landlord wants to keep you, right? So here's an example. Let's say your rent was $2,000 per month, and the tenant or you, whatever, can't afford to pay $2,000 per month anymore. Well, sometimes a landlord and tenant might strike a deal where, okay, how about this? The tenant signs a 3-year lease extension. Great tenant, let's do a 3-year lease agreement with the landlord, and let's do this. Let's do $1,800 per month for the next 12 months. That's a 10% rent reduction. Then a $100 rent reduction for every month for the next 12 months, and then back to $2,000 per month for the next 12 months thereafter. Now, obviously, you could do a variation based on this. Some people look and they say, hey, okay, well, I can't even afford $1,800. Okay, well, can you do $1,700 for the next 12 months and then the full $2,000? Or can you do $1,600, then $2,000, then $2,100, right? Something like this where you're basically trying to stretch out the rental contract term and try to take as little of a loss as possible for both sides, right? Something a tenant can afford and that the landlord's willing to accept. And maybe there's even hope for catching up on these payments. The best thing to do is stretch out the time, though. The worst case scenario is trying to say, all right, tenant's 6 months into a 12-month lease contract. Hey, all of a sudden now you're 6 months behind, your last 6 months, you owe it all at the end. The tenant might just leave. That's not good. It's better to keep somebody who's already a good tenant in the property as long as there's a way you can work out how to make the payment. So chopping it up by extending the lease term is not a terrible idea. I just signed a 3-year lease. I wouldn't be opposed to even doing a 4-year lease with the tenant. Just something where we stretch it out and we make it make sense for both parties. So in the example I just gave with $2,000 as original rent, but then going down to $1,800 for 12 months, then $1,900 for 12 months, and then back to $2,000 or some variation of that, works out to basically a rental discount for the tenant of $2,400 year one, $1,200 year two, and $0 rent three or year three. That means the landlord is actually taking a loss of $3,600 for a 3-year period, which averaged out works out to losing about $100 per month. That sounds like a lot. However, the reality is people are taking much bigger losses because if tenants and landlords don't work together, everybody ends up getting screwed. It doesn't help to have a tenant just throw up their hands and say, that's it, I'm just not paying anything. I'd rather have a new rental agreement where, yeah, maybe I'm taking less rent, but I don't have to deal with the re-rental. I don't have to deal with the re-rental fees. I don't have to face a potential eviction. I don't have to face repairing a property during the pandemic. And then I don't have to hit the rental market during a pandemic. These are all problems. Some landlords are even trying to write in waivers of tenants having the right to claim protection under eviction bans if the landlord gives the tenant a rent break. So it's something that I don't know if that would ever hold up. Obviously, that's an attorney question. But some people are trying to do that. Like, hey, here's an addendum that says you're getting a rent reduction because you're agreeing that because of the pandemic, you can now make these new payments. But now you waive your right to say, hey, well, I can't make my rent payments anymore because of the pandemic. I have no idea if any of that stuff's going to hold up. But again, I'd rather have a longer term contract and not have to deal with the property for a few years and just look, everybody's hurting right now. Just share the responsibility. I don't mind sharing responsibility with my tenants. Obviously, I don't want to pay everything. I don't want my tenants not to pay. And that's why I'd rather work with my tenants. And that's exactly what we've done. This was especially important because in April, we had a really horrible rental market. In April, it was like impossible to rent a property. Now we'll talk about strategies for renting a property in a very difficult market, but you want to weigh this out as well as a tenant and a landlord. While you're negotiating as a tenant, you got to ask yourself, are there other rental properties available? If you're in a really competitive space as a tenant, you probably want to make things good with your current landlord. If there are tons of rentals available, well, then you have the upper hand essentially, because the landlord's going to look and go, okay, what's my competition? Oh crap, I got a 3-bedroom, 2-bath. Well, there are like 20 other ones available. That's a bad day. We had that issue in April. We don't have that issue anymore. Now, if a property comes up for rent, we can rent a property almost instantly. In fact, take a look at the footage from this property. It's almost in mint condition. And that's because this tenant ended up breaking their lease. And that brings up option number 3. When a tenant breaks the lease, the tenant is technically responsible for putting the property not into the original condition as to when they rented it, but into a now rentable condition. That actually means the tenant becomes responsible for things like paint, which ordinarily the landlord would be responsible for. So a tenant breaking a lease can be great if the landlord has a strong rental market. Right now in Southern California, there is a very strong rental market. I put a property up for rent, I get applications like crazy. So as a landlord, I'm less inclined to negotiate now than I was in April because I could easily find other tenants, obviously unless they stop paying, which we'll talk about that in just a moment. When a tenant breaks a lease though, they are also responsible for covering re-rental fees and cleaning up the property to get it rent ready and showing the property. All of these things can actually be helpful for transitioning to a new tenant. He broke his lease and is now moving to Idaho. He left the property in amazing condition. I'm really, really jazzed. I mean, everything's beautiful. The flooring's in great shape. The paint is in great shape. The windows are in great shape. And this is normal. When a tenant breaks their lease, we do a walkthrough with them prior to them officially leaving. And we give them a quick little overview like, hey, you'll get your full deposit back if you just do this, 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 and this. He literally did everything. I mean, look at this. This is spotless. This entire property is just spotless. But anyway, it's just so sad to see that a tenant has to basically leave the state that they're in because their business basically got canceled by the pandemic. And these are normal, hardworking people who want to be working, but they can't because of the pandemic. Whatever type of work he was in is not something that's possible for him to do now.
All right, well, now let's talk about the elephant in the room. How do you actually rent a property during a pandemic? Well, here's the thing. When it comes to renting a property during the pandemic, you have to know your rental market. It's kind of just like in the earlier option where I say, hey, how hard do you want to negotiate? Well, what's happening in the market? In April, for example, I had to take a property that was renting for $2,775. A tenant had a military relocation. It was a VA tenant. Great. They're allowed to break their lease. Tenant leaves, and we have to re-rent the property in April. Well, we had to put the property up for $2,495. That was about a 10% discount just to find a highly qualified tenant. Now, obviously, during the pandemic, the most valuable tenants are tenants who have jobs with steady income. And so jobs without steady income are going to be things like retail and hospitality. Now, keep in mind, you can't discriminate against source of income, but you can qualify stability of income. And if a tenant can't prove stability of income, then generally, and remember, I'm a dude on YouTube, I'm not an attorney, generally, you don't have to rent to somebody if they can't prove they have stable income. Now, this sucks for all the tenants who don't have a stable income right now. All the tenants who are relying on unemployment, but they're not getting it because they're getting ripped off by a stupid, lousy, lame Congress that we have. That's horrible. But if you have to put a property up for rent, obviously right now, you gotta find jobs and careers that are going to be okay. Internet entrepreneurs, nurses, doctors, any kind of essential service, police, fire, military, pretty much anything except for retail and hospitality. And that's really bad. Now, if you can find retail and hospitality tenants who can prove to you that they have stable income, well, then you have to rent to them. As long as they qualify otherwise, right? You can't tell somebody, well, I'm not renting to you because you work for a hotel, but meanwhile, they have stable income. If they have stable income, that qualifies. Anyway, obviously confirm all of this with your real estate attorney. But as a tenant, this is also really good to know. Overall, though, I recommend for landlords and tenants, look, the easiest way for a tenant to rent a property and the best tenant for a landlord to pick is both of y'all follow a minimum criteria, a minimum credit score, minimum job and asset requirements, minimum identity verification. A good tenant should be able to provide all of these things, and a good landlord will ask for verification of all of these things.
Well, all right, today is July 31st, and the last tenant left us this morning, and it is now 6:32 p.m., and here's the new tenant. So things are actually moving faster again in the rental market. The rental market in April sucked. And I got my belt on, I promise you, but the mic's here. The rental market was so bad in April. We had to discount properties around 15% to get properties rented. Rents are back up now, but this next wave, this eviction crisis we might be facing without an unemployment boost is going to be a problem. Because realistically, this tenant, even though the first tenant we had here, they ended up paying, they kept the place clean, everything was good, they cleaned up before they left. Knock on wood, I don't know if I even got wood in this thing, but that could have gone bad. They could have just said, hey, we're stopping paying rent because of COVID, we're not leaving, evict us. And we would have probably had to go 6 or 7 months without basically collecting rent. Which then you think okay, well, Kevin, you could just take mortgage forbearance. If the tenant's not paying rent, just take mortgage forbearance. Sure, but as a real estate investor, I can't take mortgage forbearance, because if I take mortgage forbearance, I can't buy real estate anymore. I can't do my job. I can't invest in real estate anymore. So I can't take mortgage forbearance. Like, I would literally have to eat every penny that a tenant would not be paying me right now, which sucks. And I just imagine, like, these here, see these like apartment buildings and all this? This stuff has got to be, I would not be surprised if they just have to take mortgage forbearance on each of these properties, because they probably have 30% of tenants just like, you know, not even talking to the landlords anymore. Just like, well, eviction ban, all right, I guess I don't have to pay. So, I mean, I mean, counting my blessings here, knock on wood, but holy smokes, like the unemployment boost saved us on this deal. And, you know, the expiration of this boost is going to be bad for a lot of America if we don't get this solved and we get some kind of boost passed.
Best case scenario though, it's obviously just really important to try to keep properties occupied during this crazy pandemic that we're in. In case you need more help, and I'm going to go into another problem that comes up here in a moment, but in case you need more help, Lauren and I do have a complete real estate investing course and do-it-yourself property management and rental renovations program. Those are both linked down below. If you buy the investing course, which everybody loves when they join it, there's so much information in there. When you buy the investing course, you'll actually get a bundle coupon after you check out for the investing course, and you'll get a special code on the management course in case you wanted to bundle up. But now let's talk about the eviction and forbearance problem. Here's the thing. The eviction ban is a big problem because if a tenant stops paying rent completely, a tenant stops communicating, or you know, for whatever reason, there's no getting a hold of a tenant, there's really nothing a landlord can do but evict a tenant. Which is unfortunate because if there's an eviction ban and a tenant isn't communicating, there's really not a lot that you can do. So at this point, it's critical, unless it's already, I guess, gotten to this point, it's critical before this point for a landlord and tenant to keep an open dialogue as much as possible, because ultimately the tenant gets mega screwed. It might seem like in the short term, like, oh, wait a minute, Kevin, no, the landlord's going to get mega screwed. Well, probably not. The landlord might get screwed in the short term, but here's what happens. When tenants break their contracts, they still technically owe the money. And if a landlord sues a tenant doesn't show up to court, and unless there's some miracle bailout from Congress, that back rent is going to become debt. And that debt can become a collection or a judgment or both against the tenant, which could affect the tenant's credit score. Now the tenant tries to go buy a car or buy a house or go rent a place. It gets really hard for the tenant to do those things. Maybe they skip town or go to a completely different state, but a lot of times collections can follow people across the country. So this is really bad for tenants. And again, it's really bad for landlords in the short term too, because landlords have to suck up all the payments, which again, keeping that open dialogue, so important. But in this kind of situation, a landlord might be basically backed into a corner where they have to take mortgage forbearance. And as a real estate investor, this can kind of suck because it means you can't buy or refinance real estate anymore until you've made your payments again for 3 months. So this is where tenants are really going to have an upper hand against investors. So as an investor and as a tenant, really important, keep that open dialogue throughout the entire phase. Somebody's got the upper hand over somebody. But ultimately, and I feel terrible about this, but ultimately it's almost always the tenant who gets shafted because the tenant either gets hung with all the debt in a lawsuit or a judgment, or, you know, the tenant has to keep paying even if they're unemployed and they're not getting enough benefits and support from the state. And that sucks. And so this is why I encourage, whenever you can, as a landlord or a tenant, try to negotiate something that's just win-win for everyone. Even if that means a short-term discount and a little bit of a higher payment later, that's great. If you have to have a broken lease, well, then analyze your rental market to see what you're actually up against and who has the upper hand in the negotiation. Both sides can do this. And ultimately, if a tenant is not responding, well, that's the worst situation to be in. You'd have to take mortgage forbearance as a landlord just to be able to survive that period. But again, it's really bad for the tenant because that could come back to haunt the tenant. Now, best case scenario, Congress comes in and actually gets off their butts and does something. But for right now, we can't guarantee that that's happening. So here's kind of exactly what's going on in the real estate world right now, and the 3 main situations you might be in regarding tenants not paying rent and when you're up against forbearance. You also have those initial 3 options that we talked about for how to negotiate with a tenant, getting them that rental assistance if possible, negotiating a better payment structure where maybe rent is lower now but then ticks up over time. Maybe the landlord ends up taking a loss over the 3 years, but extending that term is such an easy way to keep properties occupied, especially in a competitive rental market. And then of course there's always the option of breaking a lease. So these are really the options that come up in a scenario like this. These are and have been my responses. I'm fortunate that right now all tenants are paying. We haven't had any evictions. I've never had an eviction. Knock on wood, that stays that way. You know, we will do whatever we can to help everybody out. Fortunately, again, right now the rental market's very strong here, but do your best, everybody, to try to help each other out because it's a crazy time out there right now, and it's tough for landlords and it's tough for tenants, and a lot of it is just not fair. So thank you so much for watching. Check out the real estate investing course down below, the do-it-yourself property management and rental renovations course as well. I keep updating all of these courses, so I really appreciate y'all. And folks, we'll see you next time.